Have you ever wondered how many warnings a person can leave? Before someone finally listens, the night was still. Not because of peace, but because of fear. A cold room, peeling walls. A lampshade swaying as if it were breathing. The body on the floor was still warm. The eyes open, frozen in the last second of consciousness. But the strangest thing was the blood. It wasn't running. It was drawing. Slowly, almost with intention, it had traced a short word. Incomplete. Almost. Erased. As if someone had tried to write with life draining from their veins. And still, no one read it. The sound of the siren broke the silence 30 minutes later. Too late. The investigators surrounded the scene, talked to each other, took photos, collected impressions. But they passed right over the message. It was the last clue in a series of crimes that seemed to have no connection whatsoever. But there was. A connection that screamed in red, in every detail ignored. But no one wanted to listen. Or worse, no one wanted to understand. Have you ever been through this? Being faced with something obvious, but being the only one to see it. Feeling that there is a truth buried right in front of everyone's eyes, but that no one wants to dig up. This story begins like this. With a man or an idea who left clues in each death. Real clues, painful, planned, but invisible to those who just want to close the case, not solve the enigma. It wasn't just a killer, it was a perpetrator. Each victim, a sentence. Each scene, a paragraph. And the entire city? An unread book. A book that burns in the hands, but no one opens it. And now ... maybe it's too late. Because that word on the ground, written with the last breath of life of the last victim, was not a cry for help. It was a warning, a confession in code. A note. For those who know how to read blood. And you ... do, you know? Stay with me until the end. Because the last code destroys everything you believe in. The police called it a coincidence. The press mass hysteria. But there was something beyond what was seen. The position of the body. The deliberate absence of an object. The radio turned to static. The window was open, but there were no signs of entry. None of this was there by chance. It was a macabre theater, staged scene by scene. A silent manifesto left by someone who didn't just want to kill. He wanted to be understood, revered, deciphered. What you're about to discover now may surprise you. Because the signs were all there, from the first body. It's just that no one read them in time. In the next part, you'll understand why this story isn't just about murder. It's about language. About unheard screams. About someone who begged to be noticed. And when he realized he wouldn't be, he decided to turn his victims into signs. Signs that are still there. Scattered, marked, waiting for someone, maybe you, to finally understand. But perhaps most disturbing is the knowledge that all of this could have been avoided. If only someone had noticed that first word written in blood. If only they had looked twice at that broken mirror. If only they had listened to what the silence was saying. The killer never wanted to fade into the shadows. He wanted to be followed. He needed someone to understand the story he was telling. But no one read it. No one listened. No one. Except now. And if you've come this far, it's because you feel it too. You feel that there's something more. Something hidden behind the surface. And that's why I need you to be with me in this investigation. Because each video here is a new piece, a new clue, a new echo coming from the depths of minds that have never found peace. Subscribe to the channel, but not as a number, as someone who wants to decipher what has been ignored. Here, each story does not end where it seems. And what you will discover in the next ones may change everything you think about right, wrong, and what exists in between. This subscription isn't just so you don't miss the next case. It's because the more people join this search, the more voices gain strength. And maybe that's what he wanted all along, for someone to listen, for someone to finally understand. So stay, because what comes next is even darker. And much truer. He lay on his back, eyes half open, almost at peace, but only almost. His face was frozen in an expression that didn't look like fear, but was sure. Like you'd understood something at the last second. Like you'd seen, in the glint of a blade or the shadow of a figure, what no one else had been able to see. The first victim hadn't screamed. There had been no struggle. No door had been forced open. No sign of forced entry. But there was something there. Something out of place. The desk chair was facing the wall, and on it was a piece of paper torn in half. No one paid any attention. It looked like trash. Accidental. But the paper was folded exactly 3 times. And there was a jagged cut on the side, as if it had been torn from something larger. The forensics team ruled it irrelevant. It had no blood or fingerprints on it. But if anyone had looked more closely, they would have noticed the almost invisible pencil marks on the back, a name, a date, and one incomplete word, trap. The official report called it an isolated accident. They said he slipped, hit his head, collapsed. But they didn't explain why his wedding ring was in his pants pocket instead of on his finger, or why the bathroom mirror was covered with a dark cloth, or why his alarm clock was set to go off at 3:33 a.m., the exact time his heart stopped. They said there was no evidence of homicide, but there was. They just weren't looking in the right place. Whoever killed didn't leave conventional traces. He left symbols, behavior, disruptions, a silent logic too sophisticated for eyes trained only to look for blood. The killer knew exactly what he was doing, and more than that, he knew that no one would understand. Because the first body wasn't just the beginning, it was the test, a subtle provocation, an opening piece in a game that had its end written all along. And the most important piece was always on the floor. In the corner of the room, almost invisible, was a mark. A light line made with some pasty substance, perhaps soap. A semicircle with a straight line cutting it in half. The drawing seemed random, unimportant. But it would be repeated, almost identical in all the other scenes. Always to the left of the body, always below the eye level, always erased before the forensics team arrived, and still nothing. Have you ever had that feeling that something was wrong, even when everything seemed to be in order? Like the world was screaming that some piece was out of place, but everyone around you insisted that you were imagining it? That's exactly what a rookie agent felt that morning. He walked onto the scene, looked at the arrangement of the objects, and whispered, "There's something here." But no one heard him. He wasn't allowed to comment. He was just there to learn. And that day, he learned to keep quiet. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because the hidden truth behind this first case reveals not only the criminal's profile, but also the mentality of an entire system that prefers a quick solution to true understanding. It's easier to label it as an accident. It's more comfortable to pretend there's no pattern, because admitting otherwise requires a complete transformation in the way we look at reality. And this change is scary. It requires decision, courage. It requires going behind the scenes of pain, where no one likes to go. This first crime was more than a warning. It was a mental trap. Anyone who wanted to understand it would have to abandon common logic. They would have to see beauty in the disturbance, coherence in the chaos. Because the killer didn't just want to be found. He wanted to be read, interpreted, echoed. His work needed a reader willing to walk through the darkness with their eyes open. And that's what makes it all the more disconcerting. Because if, on that first death, someone had deciphered that symbol, if they had connected that name to that date, everything might have been different. But it wasn't. And the game went on. Write in the comments. What was the moment in your life when you felt like no one heard you, even when you were screaming inside? Or just write, "I was ignored too." Perhaps like the stories we're exploring here, What you have to say is still waiting to be read. There was something sickening about the repetition, and those watching from the outside might still think it was a coincidence. But those watching from the inside didn't, because while the city tried to move on, pretending that the first case was an isolated tragedy, the second body appeared, and along with it, the same silence, the same aesthetics, the same coldness. There was no rush, there was no mess. It was almost as if each element had been placed with artistic intention, disturbing, but meticulous. The second body was found 2 months later, in another neighborhood at another time with a different profile. Apparently, there was no connection whatsoever. A woman, 37 years old, a nurse. No criminal record, no involvement in crime, no family conflicts, but the room. The room told a different story. The radio was on, playing a single track on a loop, a melancholic, almost hypnotic instrumental song. Next to the body, the same marker, rather, a more precise variation of the previous one. The cutout semicircle now had 2 dots below it, like eyes. In the scene, again, there was no sign of a struggle, but the position of the objects repeated the same pattern. An overturned chair, a wedding ring in the pocket, a covered mirror. The time of death calculated with the same symbolic precision. The killer didn't just repeat himself, he evolved. He refined himself. And the most disturbing thing was realizing that all of this wasn't just a ritual, it was a message. A fragmented composition, but no one seemed ready to understand that. Media was quick to suggest that the victim was struggling with emotional issues. They hinted at depression, possible suicide. They rushed to fit the case where it fit, except in the right place. They ignored the most obvious detail, the music. That particular track wasn't on any local radio station. It was a digital file, played by a device plugged into an outlet, hidden behind a curtain. No one questioned who put it there. No one asked where the music came from. It was as if, once again, the scene was being treated more as a nuisance than a warning. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because by the time the third body turned up, the city had already developed a shell. It was no longer shock, it was discomfort. Death was now seen with haste. And that was precisely what allowed the killer to make his boldest mark yet. A middle-aged man, a college professor, found sitting in his reading chair as if asleep. But the book on his lap was open to a specific page where a single word had been circled in pen. Understand. At the back of the room, the same music, the same arrangement of objects, the same symbol, this time engraved with fire on a piece of varnished wood. The pattern no longer whispered. It shouted. But no one seemed willing to listen. The police were divided. Some were beginning to believe that there was a mastermind behind all this. Others, more skeptical, preferred not to make hasty connections. It was safer to treat these cases as isolated cases, more comfortable, less alarming. But those who paid attention, those who observed the scenes behind the scenes, saw the hidden truth. The choice of victims was not random. There was an emotional logic, a shared trauma, an invisible line that united the three, as if they were chapters of the same book written by force, in red ink. This wasn't just a crime series. It was a journey constructed with psychological precision. And the closer you get to its logic, the more you realize it's not just about finding the culprit. It's about deciphering why he's screaming, what he wants you to feel, and how far you're willing to go into that darkness with no guarantee of return. Because when someone decides to transform pain into a narrative, each death ceases to be just a loss and becomes a statement that requires attentive eyes, an open mind, and the willingness to see what no one else wants to touch. Transformation does not happen when everything is clear. It is born in friction, in doubt, in the disturbance that tears us from our comfort zone. And this case, more than any other, demands this change of mindset. The killer does not kill on impulse. He kills to build something, an inverted legacy, a manifesto through crooked paths. And each symbol, each song, each object out of place ... is part of this encrypted message that is only revealed to those who insist on continuing to look, even when everything tells them to look away. Now that the pattern has begun to form, everything that was once noise begins to align like a macabre score, a sequence of cold notes that compose something bigger, more cruel, more calculated. And understanding this pattern is the only way forward if we want to stop what is yet to come. Because the feeling that things are going to get worse is not paranoia, it is intuition. And it is usually right. Write in the comments, what was the moment in your life when you felt like the pieces were there, but no one wanted to put the puzzle together? Or simply, I saw the pattern too. Stay with me until the end. Because when the fourth mark appears, there will be no more time to deny it. For weeks, the cases continued to be treated as separate noises within a predictable urban chaos. But for those who paid attention to the details, for those who understood the real-world aspects that never fit together, something finally began to bother them. And it was precisely at that point that the truth began to move. Not in the newspapers, not in the forensic reports, but in the margins behind the scenes, where only those who were not trained to look away could see it. She was a journalist, tired of repeated headlines, of tragedies packaged as disposable products. Almost no one remembers her name. She was not well known. She was not in demand. She worked in the city department, writing about potholes, floods, and property tax hikes. But she had something that almost no one else had: time and real curiosity. Not the curiosity of a reporter who seeks an audience, but the curiosity of someone who feels uncomfortable with things that don't make sense. She was the one who noticed the dates. The 3 crimes happened on seemingly random days, but in all of them, there was a subtle connection to commemorative dates that did not appear on the common calendar. Birthdays of forgotten figures, historical events of little repercussion. On each of these dates, an invisible collective memory seemed to echo, a kind of distorted tribute, hidden beneath the blood and silence. She was not sure, but something there screamed for attention. She began to put together a mural, connecting names, symbols, objects. Alone, in the corner of a newsroom that barely noticed her presence. Meanwhile, a detective on medical leave was receiving unofficial copies of the reports on all 3 cases. He was no longer on the active force. He had been sidelined after a nervous breakdown on another unsolved case. But he was still talking to someone on the inside. And when he received the documents, something stopped him cold. Not because of the photos of the bodies, not because of the evidence itself, but because of one specific image, taken unintentionally. The reflection in the glass of one of the windows at the scene of the second crime. There, in the background of the image, was writing, barely visible. A code scrawled in the bottom corner of the window. It wasn't blood or marker. It was condensation. Letters drawn with a finger, as if someone had used their own breath to write there before disappearing. And again, no one had seen it. No one had even noticed the reflection. Until him, the photo was sent for analysis. No one could translate what was written. But the journalist, the one no one would listen to, began to cross-reference the symbols in the code with a sequence found in an old book on cryptography used during World War II. The writing wasn't a signature. It was a question. Translated, it said, "How many times do you have to see it before you believe it?" Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because this is exactly where the line between observer and game piece begins to blur. When someone gets too close to the truth, the game changes. And that's what happened to both of them. The journalist began to be followed. Strange messages appeared in the glove compartment of her car. Small figures made of folded paper, always, with the same symbol drawn in blue pen. At the bottom, a different sentence each time. The first one said, "You're seeing what you shouldn't." The second, "Keep going, and they will know." The third, "She never told." The detective, on the other hand, was found unconscious in his own home. Nothing had been stolen. No sign of a break-in. Just one detail that was impossible to ignore: on the bathroom mirror, written in the same handwriting as the code, a single sentence, "Now it's your turn." And a symbol drawn with something no one could identify. It wasn't ink. It wasn't blood. It was something thicker. Something that smelled like metal but dried like wax. The people who tried to understand ended up becoming part of the narrative. As if the mystery itself had defense mechanisms. As if by trying to unravel it, you were dragged into it. This reveals an even darker layer. The killer doesn't just create his scenes. He watches whoever dares to get close. He wants to be read, but only by those who have the courage to cross the line. And those who cross rarely come back whole. There's a psychological pattern here. An internal structure that goes beyond the desire to kill. There is a symbolic construction, a hidden intention to convey something. As if each death were just the visible surface of a much deeper message. A sick reflection of an internal transformation that the killer himself experienced. As if all of this were the unfolding of a personal journey, not just of hatred, but of rupture, of trauma, of a distorted search for meaning. We are faced with a mentality that communicates through symbols, that feeds on impact, that hides between the lines of normality. And it is precisely there, where no one pays attention, that it reveals itself. Because the pain that cannot find words screams with images. And that is exactly what he did. He created images, scenes, atmospheres, and if the city did not understand, he tried to scream even louder. Write in the comments, have you ever felt punished for seeing what no one else could see? Or simply write, I saw between the lines. No one is born a shadow. Darkness forms little by little, drop by drop, screaming inside, silence outside. And that's how it began, not with a crime, but with absence. The absence of someone who would look you in the eye and say, I see you. He grew up as an unfinished sketch of a person, pushed into the corners of the school, the house, the mind. His life was a blank space, scribbled on by others, a name that no one called, a face that no one remembered, a body that was only touched to hurt. At the age of 7, he was left alone in the hospital for more than 12 hours. High fever, delirium, and no visitors. The nurse filled out the paperwork in red pen, scribbling, no guardians. When he left, no one picked him up. He returned alone. His shoes were a different size, hurriedly lent by a volunteer. He didn't complain. He was used to keeping quiet. Because at that age he already knew, those who shout are not heard. Only those who remain silent for a long time and explode are the ones who scare people. At 12, he was kicked out of class for staring at the wall for over an hour. When the teacher questioned him, he replied, I'm trying to understand silence. They laughed. They laughed out loud. But not him. He recorded the scene. And in his mind, that humiliation became an argument. Not against the teacher, but against the world. Now I want to go even deeper into the subject. Because understanding the logic of someone like that requires breaking the comfort of our own. And it's not about justifying what he did. Nothing justifies the irreversible. But there is a dangerous revelation that needs to be made. He didn't want to be arrested. He never did. He wanted to be read, to be understood. He saw himself as an author, a storyteller who never had paper until he decided to write on what was left, flesh. He wrote with knives, symbols, objects. Each death was a sentence that echoed a forgotten childhood. Each body left behind was a comma between traumas. While the city slept, he created chapters. He wrote the script. He chose music, objects, and lighting, not out of fetish, but for aesthetic reasons. It was as if he were trying, in some way, to give form to the void. As if he were saying, "Look, this is what I was forced to be, see?" He didn't run. He didn't hide. On the contrary, he watched. He read the newspapers. He wrote down the words used. He made lists of the mistakes made by the press, and he got angry when they got details wrong. Like a director outraged by a shallow review of his most intimate work, there was an obsession with coherence. The victims were not random, they were archetypes. Each one represented something he had lost. The 37-year-old woman, for example, was similar to the neighbor who locked him in the bathroom whenever his parents were away. The teacher found in the chair, identical to the educator who laughed at the essay in which he described his greatest fear, that of disappearing without a trace. The fear came true, but not in the way he had anticipated. Because by deciding to tell his story in blood, he ensured that he would never be forgotten. This is the most disturbing part, and at the same time, the most human. Because behind the monstrosity, there was a paralyzed boy, screaming without sound. A scream that echoed for years until someone finally heard it, too late. He didn't kill on impulse. He killed by structure, by logic, by emotional construction. It was the way he found to rewrite his origin, to finally control the plot. If he was a ghost before, now he was the author of his own terror. And deep down, something even more painful appears. He expected someone to understand before the fourth death. He gave clues, he gave time, he wanted to be deciphered. Not out of vanity, but out of a desperate need for meaning. For someone to see the pain hidden in the layers. But no one saw it, or worse, those who saw it were afraid to look deeper. He knew, from the beginning, that he wouldn't be stopped by guns or handcuffs, but maybe by understanding. By someone who would dare to walk through the horror, not to absolve him, but to decode it. And that possibility, however small, kept him going. Like an author who writes hoping that at some point, someone will finally say, "I understood your message." Write in the comments, what part of your story do you feel has never been read by anyone? Or just, "I also wrote in the dark." It's strange to think that even after so many deaths, what he wanted most was for someone to remain. For someone to want to see beyond the surface, beyond the fear, beyond the violence. As if to say, if you stay with me, I'll show you everything. And in some way, this message is also for you. Because if you have come this far, felt the weight of this story, walked through it, and seen between the lines, then maybe you are also ready to continue this journey. And that's why I truly invite you to subscribe. Not as someone who presses a button and leaves, but as someone who understands that each new video here is another piece of this dark puzzle, another layer of an enigma that needs to be unraveled. When you subscribe, you become part of something bigger. You help keep the investigation alive. You help echo the voice of those who have never been heard, neither in life nor in death. You ensure that this narrative continues, that it deepens, that it reveals itself. Because what lies ahead has not yet been told. It is still hidden, and it needs eyes like yours. Eyes that do not look away, that face, that decipher. So sign up now. Because if you've understood this far, what comes next will play in places that no one usually goes to. And you'll want to be here to see it. Now that you know the author's mind, the scars of his childhood, the reason behind the blood. What he's going to write next isn't just another chapter. It's a mirror. And it could be pointing right at you. Most people looked at the bodies, the blood, the wounds, the scene itself, as if the horror was there, on the surface, explicit, glaring. But he never wanted to be obvious. What he wanted them to see was in the details no one else looked at. In the wrong places, in the things that seemed out of focus. He didn't leave clues in the victims. He left them in what they carried. Or rather, in what they chose to carry to the end. The nurse, for example, had a keychain with a child's drawing hanging from her purse. It was the only new thing in a set of old, worn-out objects. Inside the image was the name of a child who had died months earlier, a case that never made headlines. A death due to hospital negligence, and she was on duty. She was not charged. But she also did not speak. She remained silent. The killer did not kill her by chance. He chose someone who was carrying guilt. And he marked it not with a knife, but with a note left between the pages of an old notebook that was on her shelf. You already knew. The professor, the one who was found with an open book on his lap, had a letter on his desk that had never been sent. He had written it to his own father years before, but had never mailed it. It spoke of regret. It spoke of abandonment. In the corner of the envelope, the same date as the murder, a detail impossible to know, unless someone had read that letter before. And on the envelope, a single word had been scratched with unusual force: forgiveness. As if someone wanted it never to be read. Or as if someone didn't believe the word still had value. Every object in the scene was more than just an item. It was part of the narrative. As if the killer was saying, you search in the screams. But everything has always been silent. The victims. Fingers, for example, were always in strange positions. But not by chance. One pointed to the window. Another to a photograph. Another, with his left hand turned down, hid a crumpled note under his body. Everything was a symbol. Everything was code. And yet, no one connected the dots. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject. Because the true transformation of this story happens when we understand that the pain he spread was a desperate attempt to stitch his own together. He read life through a distorted lens. He saw in the decisions of others the flaws that shaped his own. The impact of each death was calculated not only to shock, but to symbolically punish. As if you were adjusting the scales. As if you were saying, if no one listened to me, then I'll make you listen, even if you don't want to. But most disturbingly, he did it with a kind of perverse empathy. He knew his victims. He studied their lives. He knew what they carried and what they hid. And then he decided when to strike, not with haste, but with symbolic precision. Each death was like a carefully written sentence. The handwriting might be smudged, but the intent was clear, to force others to see what they would rather not. The dates of the crimes, for example, were not at all random. They were all linked to intimate events of the victims. Anniversaries of losses, days of bad decisions, hidden memories. In one case, the murder occurred exactly 1 year after the forced abortion that the victim had hidden from her family. In another, the date coincided with the end of a disciplinary process that was never disclosed. It was as if he were saying, I see you, I know what you hide. And now the world will know too. This changes everything. Because it reveals that the killer was not an uncontrolled monster. He was an emotional architect. A profound reader of human pain. And perhaps what is most frightening is realizing how much he resembled us. How much. He carried the same frustrations, the same feeling of invisibility, the same thirst for justice. But he chose to write in blood, and his story does not accept distracted readers. Write in the comments, have you ever had something so painful, hidden that you feared it would be exposed even by those who loved you? Or just, I also left clues on the objects. Stay with me until the end. Because when the next pieces are revealed, it won't just be the killer you'll see with new eyes. It'll be you too. Everything seemed to finally fall into place. After months of parallel investigations, ignored clues and pieces that didn't fit together, someone finally began to understand. Not completely, but enough to see the outline of the monster behind the curtain. An independent investigator, removed from the corporation for reasons that no one ever explained clearly. They said he was unstable, obsessive, but the truth is that he saw what others refused to see. And perhaps that is exactly why he became dangerous. He didn't work with assumptions. He was methodical, cold, silently precise. He spent entire nights reviewing crime scene photos. He didn't look for blood or fingerprints. He looked for patterns, symmetry, contradictions, and he found them. In the position of objects in the scenes, in the sequence of victims, in the dates chosen. He connected 3 cases that, officially, had no connection at all. But they had the same code hidden behind the scenes, a sequence of numbers disguised in the time files of the reports, which formed exact coordinates. They all led to the same place, an abandoned house on the outskirts of the city. No record, no history, no reason to exist. It was there that he found his first concrete clue, not blood, not a weapon, but a wall scratched with symbols identical to those found on the edges of the victims' photos, symbols that the experts ignored. They said it was interference from the camera, reflection, but he saw it differently. He photographed, cataloged, analyzed, and then, with the boldness of someone who had nothing left to lose, he took everything to the press. He handed over dossiers, evidence, chronologies, everything carefully assembled. Everything ignored. The story came out, but it was treated as a delusion. The channel that interviewed him put on a suspenseful soundtrack, graphic effects, and sold it as entertainment. A bizarre theory from a disturbed ex-cop. The public reaction? Laughter. Sarcastic comments, memes. The monster who until then had been writing in the dark must have smiled, because it was exactly there, at the height of the exposure, that everything changed. A week later, the investigator disappeared. No trace. No note. No goodbye. Nothing. His car was found parked next to the same abandoned house. Inside, only an old tape recorder. A tape of little more than 30 seconds. His voice, choked, accelerated, said only, "He's writing the ending now." And then, silence. The tape has not been officially released, but it has been circulating on forums. People have analyzed every second of the audio. They have magnified the background. They have tried to isolate noises. Some say there is breathing behind his voice. Others claim to hear something like paper being ripped. No conclusions, just more questions, just more emptiness. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because this point in the story carries a weight that many people avoid, that of impotence. Because the investigator saw the monster. He understood part of what was being written. He screamed. He tried to warn. And he was silenced, not with explicit violence, but with something more cruel, oblivion. His disappearance became a joke on some social media. They said he had lost his mind, that he disappeared of his own free will. But anyone who read the reports, anyone who followed the sequence, knows he was too close. And the author of this story does not accept being interpreted halfway. There's something deeply unsettling about this, because it reveals how easily the truth can be distorted when it doesn't fit with what the audience wants to see. The investigator had evidence, but he didn't listen. The monster, on the other hand, understood the narrative. You created the perfect atmosphere. You wrote with symbols, sounds, silences. And you won, not because you were stronger, but because you better understood how people choose what to believe. This is the most disturbing part. The killer constructed a plot so elaborate, so psychologically sharp, that even those closest to the truth ended up swallowed up by it. The investigator was not just a victim, he was a threat, and so he was erased with the same care with which his sentences crossed out of a manuscript. No traces, no punctuation, just absence. Write in the comments. Have you ever tried to show a truth and then treated like a crazy person? Or simply, he's writing the ending now. The body was found at 4:17 a.m. in a newly rented single-story house at the end of a dead-end street. The doors were locked from the inside, no sign of a break-in. No sound heard by the neighbors. Security cameras were mysteriously corrupted. Between 3:51 a.m. and 4:19 a.m., as if someone had scripted the exact time of darkness. In the center of the room, a man, a linguistics professor, recognizable, discreet, averse to the media. He was sitting with his head back, his eyes open. But lifeless, there was no blood, no sign of a struggle. The glass of water on the table was still full. The TV was off, but the screen was frozen, as if paused on something no one else could watch. On the table was a single book, Camus. The stranger opened to page 94, and in his shirt pocket was a piece of paper folded 3 times. Small, discreet, but with the weight of a century. You read me too late. It wasn't a threat, nor a confession. It was a conclusion. The final point that the killer had promised to write. The signature. And this time, there was nothing left to interpret, because everything was there. Closed, precise, impeccable, as if that death had been drawn calmly down to the millimeter. And most disturbing of all, there were no clues. No loopholes, no mistakes. As if he had deliberately wanted to end it perfectly. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject. Because this note, despite being short, carries an emotional charge. That is impossible to ignore. You read me too late. It's not just a message to the victim. It's a collective accusation. A mirror, a slap. It's as if he's saying, you had time, you had signs, you had clues, but you chose entertainment, doubt, denial. Now it's no use anymore. The phrase seems written for everyone who tried to decipher his story, as if it were a game, without realizing that each clue ignored was a life lost. The killer always knew. He wasn't immortal. He knew that at some point, the cycle would come full circle. But he didn't just want to kill. He wanted to make a mark. He wanted to turn each death into a memory, a milestone, a symbol. And what infuriated him the most wasn't the investigation, it was the indifference, the trivialization, the laughter, the disinterest. That's why this last note is so powerful. It's a reminder that sometimes what needs to be read has been screaming for a long time, but no one wants to listen. This murder was not random. It was chosen. The professor had published a few weeks earlier an academic article on symbolism in serial crimes, in which he suggested that the killer sought recognition more than punishment, in which he stated, in no uncertain terms, that this kind of mind does not want to be stopped. It wants to be understood. And yet, after publishing this, he went about his business as usual, as if what he had written was just an idea. But someone read it, someone understood it, someone who was about to close their own narrative, and they chose it as the final chapter. This detail changes everything, because it suggests that the killer read the article, reread it, and decided that this was the exact point where the story should end, not just as revenge, but as literary coherence. It was as if he were saying, you were the only one who understood, but you understood too late. The silence of the crime scene was a kind of perverse homage. There was no chaos. There was calm, order, closure. And the most disturbing thing, the handwriting on the note was identical to the previous ones. Only this: time, without hesitation, without rushing. As if writing those 4 words had been liberating. As if, at that exact moment, he had felt that his mission was accomplished. That now, yes, someone had read it in its entirety. But it was already too late for everyone involved. The police never officially declared this case as connected to the previous ones. They said there was no material evidence, that the death was caused by undetermined external factors. But no one who saw the scene up close believes that, because everyone felt it, the weight of closure, the breath of the end, as if something invisible had finally gone silent. Satisfied? Write in the comments. Have you ever felt like you were only heard when it was too late? Or just you read me too late? They always thought he acted alone, that each death was the result of an isolated obsession built behind a sick and solitary mind. But what was never revealed to the public, what was kept secret for almost 2 years, is that everything was written down, literally documented, recorded coldly, clearly, with a type of control that does not match madness, but rather strategy. With an authorial mentality, the killer kept a diary, a simple notebook with a dark cover and yellowed pages. In it, there were no confessions. There was structure, chapters, chronology, detailed motivations, and revelations that completely changed the reading of the entire story. This notebook was found weeks after the last murder. But it wasn't hidden. It was in plain sight, inside a cardboard box at the back of a city library, among forgotten donations. As if he had left it there on purpose. As if he wanted someone to find it, but not before it was time. Among the first pages, a cold dedication for those who have never heard, but now want to understand, and then the notes began. Dates, names, places, but also feelings, fragments of memory, shadows from childhood, traumas that do not justify, but explain. He described in detail his relationship with each of the victims. And the most disturbing thing, some of them knew him. They had walked through his path, ignored his pain, stepped on it. The journalist who publicly discredited him after a poorly investigated complaint. The doctor who downplayed the signs of abuse when he was still a teenager. The teacher who joked in class about his constant silence. The deaths were not random. They were messages, answers, written with the anger of someone who had never really been read. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because the notebook reveals something even darker. In many cases, he did not kill alone. He manipulated, he persuaded, he planted ideas, he used the trauma of others as a tool. One of the victims, a 42-year-old woman with a history of depression and suicide attempts, was convinced by him to place herself exactly where the death would appear accidental. He did not touch her, but he accompanied her. He wrote the words. He gave her the script, and she followed. As if, at that moment, was the only voice that understood her, and this pattern repeats itself. The notebook tells of secret meetings, exchanges of messages, phrases left on mirrors. He infiltrated, not as a killer, but as a confidant, as a guide, and only later did he reveal his role. He used suffering as an instrument. He used the pain of others to shape his own. As if each life cut short was also an interrupted biography, but written by hands that knew exactly where to cut. Behind the scenes of the manifesto, there are almost poetic passages, not about death, but about abandonment, about what it is like to grow up in silence, about the impact of not being seen, heard, welcomed. He did not apologize, but he did not boast either. He wrote as if he were exercising something, as if he knew he would never be forgiven, but still wanted to be understood. On one of the pages he writes, "What I did has no cure, but it has a source, and no one wanted to look at it." This is perhaps the most disconcerting part of the notebook. It did not deny its monstrosity, but it demanded that it be read in its entirety, not as an end, but as a consequence. And this opens up a much deeper discussion, which goes beyond the crime. It goes back to the origin of the abandonment, to the first years of life, to school, home, broken bonds. The notebook is not an excuse, but it is a map, a mirror, and for some, a sentenced out. What is most frightening is that these notes, these truths that were kept hidden, were never officially made public. Some of the police considered them contaminated material, inadmissible, dangerous, as if by releasing them, they were giving a stage to darkness. But the question is, what if this darkness is exactly what needs to be read? What if ignoring it is repeating the cycle, feeding the next one? Write in the comments, have you ever had to hide your pain? Because you knew no one would believe it? Or just everything was written, but no one read it? Now I want to go even deeper into this subject. Because while everyone was discussing the past, something was moving discreetly in the present, while the pages of the notebook were read. In secret by a select team of experts, a new occurrence emerged with no apparent connection, but with an uncomfortable smell of déjà vu. In the interior of a small town, forgotten on the map, a young woman was found dead in circumstances that seemed banal. A fall from her own height, a poorly lit staircase, an accident certificate. But a single sentence engraved with the tip of a key on the inside of the victim's closet changed everything. Are you also going to read me too late? The handwriting? Identical, the pattern. Eerily familiar. The most disturbing thing was not the death. It was the context. Before she died, the girl had posted a text on an anonymous forum about loneliness, about the feeling of being watched, about noises that only she could hear during the night. And among the comments, an anonymous person responded, "Not all pain needs an echo. Sometimes it just needs a full stop. IP not tracked. Account deleted." Language identical to that used in the notebook. This reignited everything. Investigators went back to the archives. Language experts compared structures. And a new question arose. What if he hadn't finished? What if the period was actually a comma? What if that note, "You read me too late," wasn't the end but a warning? This type of behavioral pattern, when analyzed by forensic psychologists, reveals a perverse trait of continuity. Minds like this don't usually stop out of exhaustion. They pause, reinvent themselves, wait, test, like an author who finishes a book and begins writing another under a pseudonym. The same voice, with a new cover. Behind the scenes of the investigation, a hypothesis has been raised and until now, kept out of the media's reach, a possible disciple. Someone who read the notebook before it was collected, who understood not only the words, but the rhythm, the intention, the ritual, and who decided to keep writing, not out of admiration, but out of identification. Someone who also grew up in silence, who also used pain as a language, who, perhaps, saw in the deaths not an end, but a coded language. And here, the question that haunts us: are we facing a new killer or the same one under a new skin? The answer, so far, slips through our fingers like sand. But what is impossible to ignore is that something new has been left, a clue that, up until this very moment, no one has been able to decipher. An audio posted on an obscure profile on an abandoned social network. No face, no context. Just someone breathing. And a sentence spoken in a slow voice. The next comma has already been written, and it will bleed. This audio is only 9 seconds long, but it carries a weight that cannot be ignored. The city where it was posted is the same as the last body. The network where it appeared is the same one where the first victim of the original case exchanged messages weeks before he died. The pattern, once again, emerges not as a scream, but as a whisper. This revelation changes everything, because it indicates that the cycle may not have ended. It may have simply changed form. And this leads us to a question that no one wants to ask out loud, but which is latent in every new detail that emerges. What if this story is repeating itself now in your city? Because what seemed distant, fantastical, too brutal to be real, may be infiltrating our daily lives with the subtlety of a whisper. And when we finally listen, perhaps once again, it will be too late. Write in the comments, what was the detail that you noticed and no one else saw? Or just, the next comma has already been written. If you've come this far, it's because you felt it. Because something, deep down, caught your attention in this tangle of clues, pains, and hidden truths. And maybe you've also crossed paths with someone that no one wanted to listen to. Or maybe you've already been that person. That's why this channel exists. to give voice to what was silenced, to decipher what was ignored. And if this made sense to you, if at any point in this video you stopped, took a deep breath, and thought, "This is telling me something," then you are part of this too. And it's worth continuing. Subscribe here not only to not miss the next episodes, but to walk along in this silent investigation that is not over. Each video here is another page being turned. And by subscribing, you help this message reach where it needs to, where it can make a difference. Because there is a lot that still needs to be said, and some need to be heard by you. Also leave your comment below. Write it like this: "I'm with you until the end." Because this phrase says much more than it seems. It carries memory, pain, anger, but also loyalty. And whoever leaves this phrase will be saying, without saying it, that they understood the message in its entirety. If this video made you think, provoked you, or simply left you with that uncomfortable feeling that not everything is resolved, leave a like. Not out of vanity, but for justice. Because there are stories that can no longer be buried. And now, stay with me. There's a video here that complements all of this, and will show you what may be repeating itself right before your eyes. Click there and follow me on this journey, because this is still far from over.